Chapter 17. The House Elf Liberation Front. The noise in the slithering common room was calamitous. There were mountains of cakes and flagons of pumpkin juice and butter beer on every surface. Someone had let off some filibusters fireworks, so that the air was thick with stars and sparks. Three seventh-year girls had invented a rhyming cheer seemingly on the spot, which was quickly learned by the entire house, who hadn't stopped singing it at the top of their lungs. This time, unlike the last time there had been a celebration in Cass's honor, Violet didn't slink away to her dormitory to brood. She was right there in the thick of it, halfway through eating her second cauldron cake, laughing and cheering with all the rest as the details of the challenge were recounted, with more and more embellishment being added along the way. Adrian Pusey kept going on about Cass being caught up a huge gust of flame, setting his whole head ablaze, and he had to have Madame Pomfrey grow his hair back before he could leave the medic tent. This was all rubbish. The only visible damage Cass had sustained was his noticeably missing eyebrow. Plenty of time for that to heal up, taunted Miles Bletchley, a boy on the Quidditch team. You've got 3 whole months before they chuck another dragon at you. What's the clue? Shouted someone from the back of the crowd. Go on then, open it. A chant of "Open it. Open it" started up around the common room. Tracy, who had been given possession of the large golden egg since she'd sat down, joined in, hoisting the egg above her head with both hands. Cass grinned around at them all. You know I'm supposed to work it out on my own, right? He said, which was met with a series of jeers. You're not that clever, Warrington, said a tall 6th-year boy. Most everyone laughed and then cheered again when Cassius finally took the egg from Tracy's hands. He fumbled with it for a moment before managing to open the clasp that held it shut at the top. The shell cracked in 3 equal segments and fell open. The inside looked to be made of glass, filled with many large air pockets, but the moment Cass opened it, the most horrible noise, a loud and screechy wailing, filled the room. The nearest thing to it Violet had ever heard was the ghost orchestra at nearly headless Nick's Death Day party, who had all been playing the musical Saw. Shut it, Bletchley bellowed, his hands over his ears. What was that? Said Zoe Crichton, staring at the egg as Cassius slammed it shut again. It sounded like a banshee. Maybe you've got to get past one of those next. It was someone being tortured, cried a white-faced 2nd-year girl, who Violet recognized as one of the kids hanging around Cass the other morning. You're going to have to fight the Cruciatus curse. Don't be stupid, Imelda, that's illegal, snapped Zoe. They wouldn't use the Cruciatus curse on the champions. Bet they would if Mad Eye had anything to say about it, said Adrian darkly. A few people grimaced uncomfortably. As the conversation devolved back into replays of the first task and new theories about what the second might be, Cassius was finally able to get out of the thick of things and sit down. He plopped heavily between Violet and Tracy on the sofa and tipped the golden egg back into Tracy's lap. Careful it doesn't open, he warned. I've still got the ringing in my ears from before. Merlin's arse, how is that supposed to be a clue? It's got to mean something, Tracy said, turning the egg over in her hands to examine it more carefully. And they're right, you've got plenty of time to work it out. And we'll help again, Violet offered quickly. Even if we're not really supposed to. What, don't you think I'm clever enough either? Cass said, putting a hand to his chest in mock offense. Violet gave him a hard nudge with the point of her bony elbow. I used to, but with as much of a prat as you've been lately. Cass laughed. Yeah, all right, I deserve that. He leaned comfortably back into the cushions and draped an arm behind each of them on the back of the sofa. So long as they don't pit me against 2 dragons at once next time, I think I'll be all right. I don't see how things could get any worse. The start of December brought wind and sleet to Hogwarts. Drafty though the castle always was in winter, Violet was glad of its thick walls every time she passed the Durmstrang ship on the lake, which was pitching in the high winds, its black sails billowing against the dark skies. She thought the Beauxbaton students in their caravan was likely to be pretty chilly too. Hagrid, she noticed, was keeping Madame Maxim's horses well provided with their preferred drink of single malt whiskey. The fumes wafting from the trough in the corner of the paddock was enough to make the entire care of magical creatures class light-headed. This was unhelpful, as they were still tending to the horrible scroots and needed their wits about them. "I'm not sure whether they hibernate or not," Hagrid told the shivering class in the windy pumpkin patch next lesson. "Thought we'd juice, try and see if they fancied a kip. We'll juice, settle 'em down in these boxes." There were now only 10 scroots left. Apparently their desire to kill one another had not been exorcised out of them. Each of them was now approaching 6 feet in length. Their thick grey armor, their powerful, scuttling legs, their fire-blasting ends, their stings and their suckers combined to make the scroots the more repulsive things Violet had ever seen. The class looked dispiritedly at the enormous boxes Hagrid had brought out, all lined with pillows and fluffy blankets. "Will Juice lead 'em in here," Hagrid said, "and put the lids on, and we'll see what happens." But the scroots, it transpired, didn't hibernate, and did not appreciate being forced into pillow-lined boxes and nailed in. Hagrid was soon yelling, "Darn panic now, darn panic," while the scroots rampaged around the pumpkin patch, now strewn with the smouldering wreckage of the boxes. Most of the class, Malfoy, Crabbe, and Goyle in the lead, had fled into Hagrid's cabin through the back door and barricaded themselves in. Violet, along with Harry, Ron, and Hermione, however, were among those who remained outside trying to help Hagrid. Together they managed to restrain and tie up 9 of the scroots, through at the cost of numerous burns and cuts. Finally, only 1 scroot was left. "Darn frighten him now," Hagrid shouted as Ron and Harry used their wands to shoot jets of fiery sparks at the scroot, which was advancing menacingly on them, its sting arched, quivering over its back. Juice try and slip the rope round his sting, so he won't hurt any o' the others. "Yeah, we wouldn't want that," Ron shouted angrily as he and Harry backed into the wall of Hagrid's cabin, still holding the scroot off with their sparks. "Well, well, well. This does look like fun." Rita Skeeter was leaning on Hagrid's garden fence, looking in at the mayhem. She was wearing a thick magenta cloak with a furry collar today, and a crocodile skin handbag was over her arm. Hagrid launched himself forward on top of the scroot that was cornering Harry and Ron and flattened it. A blast of fire shot out of its end, withering the pumpkin plants nearby. "Hooray you!" Hagrid asked Rita Skeeter as he slipped a loop of rope around the scroot's sting and tightened it. "Rita Skeeter, Daily Prophet Reporter," Rita replied, beaming at him. Her gold teeth glinted. "Thought Dumbledore said you weren't allowed inside the school anymore," said Hagrid, frowning slightly as he got off the slightly squashed scroot and started tugging it over to its fellows. Rita acted as though she hadn't heard what Hagrid had said. "What are these fascinating creatures called?" she asked, beaming still more widely. "Blast-ended scroots," grunted Hagrid. "Really?" said Rita, apparently full of lively interest. "I've never heard of them before." "Where do they come from?" Violet, who had been doubled over with her hands on her knees, trying to catch her breath, noticed a dull red flush rising up out of Hagrid's wild black beard, and her heart sank. Where had Hagrid got the scroots from? Hermione, who seemed to be thinking along these lines, said quickly, "They're very interesting, aren't they, Harry?" "What? Oh, yeah. Ouch. Interesting," said Harry, as Hermione trod pointedly on his foot. "Ah, you're her, Harry," said Rita Skeeter as she looked around. "And Violet as well. So you like care of magical creatures, do you? One of your favorite lessons?" "Yes," said Harry and Violet together. Hagrid beamed at them. "Lovely," said Rita. "Really lovely. Been teaching long," she added to Hagrid. Violet noticed her eyes travel over Dean Thomas, who had a nasty cut across one cheek, Lavender Brown, whose robes were badly singed, and Violet herself, who was nursing several burnt fingers and had grass stains on her knees, and then to the cabin windows, where most of the class stood, including Tracy, with their noses pressed against the glass waiting to see if the coast was clear. "This is nigh my 2nd year," said Hagrid. "Lovely. I don't suppose you'd like to give an interview, would you? Share some of your experience of magical creatures." The Prophet does a zoological column every Wednesday, as I'm sure you know. We could feature these bang-ended scoots. Blast-ended scroots, said Hagrid eagerly. Yeah, why not? Violet opened her mouth, ready to warn Hagrid about just what a terrible idea that would be, but was stopped by Harry, eyes wide in silent warning, shaking his head. There was nothing either of them could do but stand and watch as Hagrid and Rita Skeeter made arrangements to meet in the Three Broomsticks for a good long interview later that week. Then the bell rang up at the castle, signaling the end of the lesson. Well, goodbye, Harry, Rita Skeeter called merrily, wiggling her fingers in a wave as the class set off toward the castle. Until Friday night, then, Hagrid. She'll twist everything he says, Tracy said under her breath, catching up to Violet after hurrying out of her hiding place in Hagrid's hut. She even lets him get a word in edgewise, Violet muttered. She glared angrily at Rita Skeeter's retreating form in the distance. Her anger lasted all through lunch and carried into her afternoon lessons. Professor Lupin's class was one of her favorite, but Violet couldn't muster her usual level of enthusiasm, even for him. It didn't help that they were covering trolls, which, as far as Violet could tell, were the most boringly brutish creatures to ever roam the earth. Huge and aggressively violent, trolls were also so incredibly stupid that the lowest possible grade in school was named for them. The only redeeming quality they seemed to have was that sometimes, if somebody was very good at their job, trolls could be trained to act as overgrown security guards. Violet sulked, although Lupin's attempt at a lively lecture, and left the classroom in a huff, lest her godfather caught her eye and try to ask what was bothering her. She hurried down to dinner, eager to meet up with Tracy and hopefully vent some of her lingering annoyance, but Tracy wasn't at dinner, and neither was Cassius. Nor were they in the library when she went to look for them. The only person in there was Victor Crumb and his gaggle of whispering, giggling girls, all of whom glared suspiciously as Violet while she peered around for her friends. Giving up and feeling worse than she had in hours, Violet headed back toward the dungeons. She was halfway across the entrance hall when her name was called from somewhere above. "There you are," said Tracy, racing down the marble staircase to meet her. To Violet's surprise, she was accompanied by Harry, Ron, and a very excited-looking Hermione. "You must have left dinner before we got back. Where have you been?" "Looking for you," Violet said, looking around at them all. "What's going on?" "Come and see," Hermione said, beaming and breathless with excitement. "Oh, Violet, the most amazing things happened." "What?" asked Violet. "Is it about the tournament?" Hermione shook her head fiercely, frizzy brown curls bouncing all over the place as she did. "You've just got to see it, trust me." Harry and Ron, who had nearly toppled over to avoid running into Hermione, looked up Violet and Tracy with a shrug. "She won't tell us anything either," Ron grumbled. "You coming?" Violet, bewildered but now very curious, agreed. She followed Tracy and the Gryffindors across the hall and kept going, following Hermione's brisk pace as she turned left at the bottom of the stairs. There was a passage there, mirroring the one that led down into the Slytherin dungeons. Violet knew this one must lead the way to Hufflepuff Common Room, but she had never come this way before. The four of them followed Hermione down a flight of stone steps, but instead of ending up in the chilly, quiet underground passages that Violet was expecting, they found themselves in a broad stone corridor, brightly lit with torches and decorated with cheerful painting that were mainly of food. "Oh, hang on," said Harry slowly, halfway down the corridor. "What a minute, Hermione." "What?" She turned around to look at him, anticipation all over her face. "I know what this is about," said Harry. He nudged Ron and pointed to the painting just behind Hermione. It showed a gigantic silver fruit bowl. "Hermione," said Ron, apparently understanding something. "You're trying to rope us into that spew stuff again." No, I'm not," she said hastily. "And it's not Spew, Ron. Changed the name, have you?" said Ron, frowning at her. "What are we now, then? The House Elf Liberation Front? I'm not barging into the kitchen and trying to make them stop work. I'm not doing it." "This is the way to the kitchens?" Violet asked, looking wide-eyed at the portrait before them. How did you find that out? Fred and George, Hermione said impatiently. I came down here just now to talk to them all, and I found Okamian. Harry, I want to show you. She seized Harry's arm, pulled him in front of the picture of the giant fruit bowl, stretched out her forefinger, and tickled the huge green pear. It began to squirm, chuckling, and suddenly turned into a large green door handle. Oh my God, Tracy muttered, staring as Hermione grabbed the handle and pulled. Wizard's Arisoid. The door was barely open when Hermione shoved Harry hard in the back, forcing him inside. Immediately there was a high-pitched squeal. Is that an alarm? Violet asked, ready to run, but Hermione was still beaming. Come in and see. Violet, Ron, and Tracy cautiously followed Hermione through the door. As soon as they were inside, Violet's mouth fell open. They had walked into an enormous, high-ceilinged room, large as the great hall above it, with mounds of glittering brass pots and pans heaped around the stone walls, and a great brick fireplace at the other end. There were 4 long wooden tables, which must have lined up exactly beneath the 4 house tables above, though they were clear of food now. An hour ago, they must have been laden with dishes that were sent straight up through the ceiling to their counterparts above. Most shocking of all were the elves. At least 100 of them were standing around the kitchen, looking curiously as the group of students stepped inside. They were all wearing the same uniform, a tea towel stamped with the Hogwarts crest, tied around their little bodies like a toga. The source of the shrill noises became obvious once Violet tore her eyes from the rest of the room and looked at her brother. A pair of long, thin-fingered hands were clasped around his middle, and a house elf was hugging him tightly. It is Dobby, sir, it is, squealed the elf, who was clearly the source of the noise. Dobby has been hoping and hoping to see Harry Potter, sir, and Harry Potter has come to see him, sir. Dobby let go and stepped back a few paces, beaming up at Harry, his enormous, tennis ball-shaped eyes brimming with tears of happiness. Those eyes flickered toward the movement behind Harry and landed on Violet, becoming impossibly wider. And Violet Potter has come as well, miss, Darby cried, hopping excitedly in place. The Potters have come to visit Darby. Darby can hardly believe it, miss. Darby looked almost exactly as Violet remembered him from the night, 2 years ago, that he had appeared in her and Harry's bedroom and tried to convince them not to return to Hogwarts. The pencil-shaped nose, the bat-like ears, the long fingers and feet all were the same, except the clothes, which were very different. When Darby had been enslaved by the Malfoys, he had always worn the same filthy old pillowcase. Now, however, he was wearing the strangest assortment of garments Violet had ever seen. He had done an even worse job of dressing himself than the wizards at the World Cup. He was wearing a tea cozy for a hat, on which he had pinned a number of bright badges, a tie patterned with horseshoes over a bare chest, a pair of what looked like children's soccer shorts, and odd socks, one of which was plain black and the other covered in pink and orange stripes. Darby, what are you doing here? Harry said in amazement. Darby has come to work at Hogwarts, sir, Darby squealed excitedly. Professor Dumbledore gave Darby and Winky jobs, sir. Winky, said Violet. She's here too. Yes, miss, yes, said Darby, and he seized Violet's hand and pulled her deeper into the kitchen between the 4 longer tables that stood there. The elves had gathered closer now, beaming, bowing, and curtsying as Darby hurried Harry past them. Darby stopped in front of the brick fireplace and pointed. Winky, miss, he said. Winky was sitting on a stool by the fire. Unlike Darby, she had obviously not foraged for clothes. She was wearing a neat little skirt and blouse with a matching blue hat which had holes in it for her large ears. However, while every one of Darby's strange collection of garments was so clean and well cared for that it looked brand new, Winky was plainly not taking care of her clothes at all. There were soup stains all down her blouse and a burn in her skirt. Hello, Winky, said Harry. Winky's lip quivered. Then she burst into tears, which spilled out of her great brown eyes and splashed down her front, just as they had done at the Quidditch World Cup. Oh dear, said Hermione. She, along with Ron, Harry, and Tracy, had followed Violet and Darby to the end of the kitchen. Winky, don't cry, please don't. But Winky cried harder than ever. Darby, on the other hand, beamed up at Harry. Would Harry Potter like a cup of tea? He squeaked loudly over Winky's sobs. Yeah, okay, said Harry. Instantly, about 6 house elves came trotting up behind them, bearing a large silver tray laden with a teapot, cups for all of them, a milk jug, and a large plate of biscuits. Good service, Ron said, in an impressed voice. Tracy looked completely stunned and muttered a quiet, "Thank you." Hermione frowned at them both, but the elves all looked delighted. They bowed very low and retreated. "How long have you been here, Darby?" Harry asked as Darby handed around the tea. "Only a week, Harry Potter, sir," said Darby happily. "Darby came to see Professor Dumbledore, sir. You see, sir, it is very difficult for a house elf who has been dismissed to get a new position, sir. Very difficult indeed." At this, Winky howled even harder. Her squashed tomato of a nose dribbling all down her front, thought she made no effort to stem the flow. "Darby has traveled the country for 2 whole years, sir, trying to find work," Darby squeaked. "But Darby hasn't found work, sir, because Darby wants paying now." The house elves all around the kitchen, who had been listening and watching with interest, all looked away at these words, as though Darby had said something rude and embarrassing. Hermione, however, said, "Good for you, Darby." "Thank you, miss," said Darby, grinning toothily at her. "But most wizards don't want a house elf who wants paying, miss." "That's not the point of a house elf," they said, and they slammed the door in Darby's face. "Darby likes work, but he wants to wear clothes and he wants to be paid. Harry Potter. Darby likes being free." The Hogwarts house elves had now started edging away from Darby, as though he were carrying something contagious. Winky, however, remained where she was, though there was a definite increase in her volume of crying. And then, Harry Potter, Darby goes to visit Winky and finds out Winky has been freed too, sir, said Darby delightedly. At this, Winky flung herself forward off her stood and lay face down on the flagstone floor, beating her tiny fists upon it and positively screaming with misery. Violet hastily dropped down to her knees beside her. "It's all right," she said desperately, trying to gently restrain the little elf before she could hurt herself. "Winky, please, it's all right." But nothing she said made the slightest difference. Winky wrenched away from her touch and cried all the harder while Darby continued with his story, shouting, shrilling over her screeches. And then Darby had the idea, "Harry Potter, sir. Why doesn't Darby and Winky find work together?" Darby says. "Where is there enough work for 2 house elves?" said Winky. And Darby thinks, and it comes to him, sir, Hogwarts. So Darby and Winky come to see Professor Dumbledore, sir, and Professor Dumbledore took us on. Darby beamed very brightly, and happy tears welled in his eyes again. "And Professor Dumbledore says he will pay Darby, sir, if Darby wants paying. And so Darby is a free elf, sir, and gets a galleon a week and 1 day off a month." "That's not very much," Tracy said loudly, hands clamped over her ears against Winky's continued screaming and fist-beating. "Professor Dumbledore offered Darby 10 galleons a week and weekends off," said Darby, suddenly giving a little shiver, as though the prospect of so much leisure and riches were frightening. "But Darby beat him down, miss. Darby likes freedom, miss, but he isn't wanting too much, miss. He likes work better." Apparently satisfied with this answer, Hermione knelt on the floor beside Winky and Violet and asked, "And how much is Professor Dumbledore paying you, Winky?" If she had thought this would cheer up Winky, she was wildly mistaken. Winky did stop crying, but when she sat up, she was glaring at Hermione through her massive brown eyes, her whole face sopping wet and suddenly furious. "Winky is a disgraced elf, but Winky is not yet getting paid," she squeaked. "Winky is not sunk so low as that. Winky is properly ashamed of being freed." "Ashamed," said Violet blankly. "But what do you have to be ashamed of, Winky? Mr. Crouch is the one who should be ashamed, the way he treated you. You didn't do anything wrong for him to be so horrible." But at these words, Winky clapped her hands over the holes in her hat, flattening her ears so that she couldn't hear a word, and screeched, "You is not insulting my master, miss. You is not insulting Mr. Crouch. Mr. Crouch is a good wizard, miss. Mr. Crouch is right to sack bad Winky. Winky is having trouble adjusting, miss, squeaked Darby confidentially. Winky forgets she is not bound to Mr. Crouch any more. She is allowed to speak her mind now, but she won't do it. Can't house elves speak their minds about their masters, then? Tracy asked timidly. Oh, no, miss, no, said Darby, looking suddenly serious. T's part of the house elf's enslavement, miss. We keeps their secrets and our silence, miss. We upholds the family's honor, and we never speaks ill of them, though Professor Dumbledore told Darby he does not insist about this. Professor Dumbledore said we is free to. Darby looked suddenly nervous and beckoned Tracy closer. Tracy and Harry bent forward. Darby whispered, he said we are free to call him a balmy old codger if we likes, miss. Darby have a frightened sort of giggle. But Darby is not wanting to, Harry Potter, he said, talking normally again and shaking his head so that his ears flapped. Darby likes Professor Dumbledore very much, sir, and is proud to keep his secrets and our silence for him. But you can say what you like about the Malfoys now, Harry asked him, grinning. A slightly fearful look came into Darby's immense eyes. Darby could, he said doubtfully. He squared his small shoulders. Darby could tell Harry Potter that his old masters were bad dark wizards. Darby stood for a moment, quivering all over, horror-struck by his own daring. Then he rushed over to the nearest table and began banging his head on it very hard, squealing, "Bad Darby." "Bad Darby," Tracy gasped in horror and turned away from the sickening sight, but Harry grabbed Darby by the back of his tie and pulled him away from the table. "Thank you, Harry Potter, thank you," said Darby breathlessly, rubbing his head. "You just need a bit of practice," Harry said. "Practice," squealed Winky furiously. "You is ought to be ashamed of yourself, Darby, talking that way about your masters." "They aren't my masters any more, Winky," said Darby defiantly. "Darby doesn't care what they think any more." "Oh, you is a bad elf, Darby," moaned Winky, tears leaking down her face once more. "My poor Mr. Crouch, what is he doing without Winky? He is needing me, he is needing my help. I is looking after the Crouches all my life, and my mother is doing it before me, and my grandmother is doing it before her. Oh, what is they saying if they knew Winky was freed? Oh, the shame, the shame." She buried her face in her skirt again and bawled. "Please, Winky, you don't need to be ashamed," Violet tried again, soothingly. "Mr. Crouch is a grown man. I'm sure he's getting along perfectly well on his own. He looked just fine when we saw him last. You is seeing my master," said Winky breathlessly, raising her tear-stained face out of her skirt once more and gargling at Violet. "You is seeing him here at Hogwarts." "Yes," said Violet. "He and Mr. Bagman are judges in the Triwizard Tournament." "Mr. Bagman comes too," squealed Winky, and to Violet's great surprise she looked angry again. "Mr. Bagman is a bad wizard, a very bad wizard. My master isn't liking him, oh no, not at all." "Bagman bad," said Harry. "Oh yes," said Winky, nodding her head furiously. "My master is telling Winky some things, but Winky is not saying. Oh, Winky keeps her master's secrets." She dissolved yet again into tears. They could hear her sobbing into her skirt. Poor master, no Winky to help him no more. They couldn't get another sensible word out of Winky. They left her to crying and finished their tea, while Darby chatted happily about his life as a free elf and his plans for his wages. "Darby is going to buy a sweater next, Harry Potter," he said happily, pointing at his bare chest. "Tell you what, Darby," said Ron, who seemed to have taken a great liking to the elf. "I'll give you the one my mum knits me this Christmas. I always get one from her. You don't mind maroon, do you?" Darby was delighted. "We might have to shrink it a bit to fit you," Ron told him, "but it'll go well with your tea cozy." As they prepared to take their leave, many of the surrounding elves pressed in upon them, offering snacks to take back upstairs. The girls all refused. Violet felt a sharp pang in her chest, watching the way the elves kept bowing and curtsying, but Harry and Ron loaded their pockets with cream cakes and pies. "Thank a lot," Harry said to the elves, who had all clustered around the door to say good night. "See you, Darby, Harry Potter. Can Darby came and see you sometimes, sir?" Darby asked tentatively. Course you can, said Harry, and Darby beamed. Tracy was very quiet on the way out of the kitchens and up the stairs leading back into the entrance hall. She waved distractedly at Harry, Ron, and Hermione as they ascended the marble staircase toward Gryffindor Tower, and her gaze was far away as she and Violet headed toward the dungeons. When Violet looped their arms together, she didn't get the warm smile that she was used to. Are you okay? Violet asked, peering at Tracy in the low torchlight. Tracy nodded faintly, then changed course and shook her head instead. I didn't realize they were magicola bound like that, she said quietly, still with that faraway look in her eyes. The way Winky talked about that Crouch man, keeping his secrets and all. And the other one, Darby, when he just started hurting himself like that, Tracy stopped walking and drew in a sharp, shuddering breath. It was a moment before Violet realized Tracy had started crying. Tracy, I'm so sorry. I should have warned you. Tracy laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound at all. Romans 6, nothing you could have said would prepare me for all that, she said shakily. Tracy made a noise of disgust, hastily scrubbing the tears from her face with the back of her hand. There's just so much. Ah, come on. Tracy held her hand out, and Violet quickly took it in her own. I think I just need to go to bed and sleep on all this. It's too much for right now. Chapter 18. The Unexpected Task. If he may have your attention. Professor Snape's soft, irritated voice cut through the curious chattering that filled the slithering common room, and everyone fell immediately silent. It was just past 8 o'clock on Thursday morning, and Violet, along with everyone else, had been woken by their prefects and shepherded upstairs for some sort of announcement. Everyone was gathered around in the little groups, wondering aloud why they'd been woken so early and if it had anything to do with the tournament. Cassius, holding the large golden egg to his chest, looked noticeably green as he sat there in his pajamas. Professor Snape had greeted them all with his usual silent glare, standing in front of the doorway to the common room looking stiff and displeased. At the headmaster's insistence, Snape began, after they'd all fallen appropriately quiet, I have been tasked with announcing to you all that the Yule Ball is approaching. It is a traditional part of the Triwizard Tournament, and I have been informed, an opportunity for the students of Hogwarts to socialize with our foreign guests. Someone at the back of the room let out a shrill giggle. A wave of tittering whispers threatened to overtake the common room, but was quickly suppressed by Professor Snape, loudly clearing his throat. The ball will be open only to fourth years, and above though you may invite younger students, should you wish. There was an excited rustling amongst the third and second years. Snape quelled it with a glance and continued, his large nostrils flaring warningly. Dress robes will be worn by all attendants, meaning if you lack the appropriate garments you will not be allowed to attend. The ball will start at 8 o'clock on Christmas evening, meaning you will have ample time to prepare yourselves. Now then, Professor Snape set his shoulders. It looked to Violet as though he were steeling himself for something. The headmaster is of the opinion, he began flatly, that the Yule Ball is a chance for us all to let our hair down. There was a loud snort of laughter from somewhere near the fireplace, quickly followed by a hacking cough. Violet bit down on the inside of her lip to stop from laughing as well. Professor Snape's greasy hair already hung down to his shoulders, and standing there looking like he was about to hex the whole lot of them, it was hard to imagine him letting loose in any sense of the word. However, he hissed through gritted teeth, and the whole room fell carefully silent once more. That does not mean that I will be relaxing my expectations for the behavior of members of this house. I will be. He paused, his black eyes gleaming menacingly around at each and every one of them, seriously displeased, should a Slytherin student cause embarrassment to this school in any way. Do I make myself clear? Everyone in the room nodded dutifully. When Professor Snape raised a black eyebrow, they quickly intoned, Yes, sir. He glared at them all a moment longer, surely trying to impress upon them the severity of what his displeasure might be, and then sniffed disdainfully. Warrington, said Snape, and Cass's head snapped up so fast that Violet was certain she heard a crack. Sir, it is tradition for the champions and their partners to open the ball. Ha, Cass said blankly. Professor Snape gave him a withering look. Theoden's partners, Warrington. You will be expected to represent your house and your school in the performance. See to it that you brush up on your footwork. Cass's mouth was hanging open in shock. But I don't have a partner, sir. Then get one, Snape snapped. You have until Christmas, though if you intend to woo some unfortunate classmate, before then I suggest wiping that ridiculous look off your face. Dismissed, all of you. A week ago, Violet would have said there was nothing more stressful than watching two of the people she cared about most facing down a pair of dragons. But now that she had done the latter, and was facing the prospect of having to attend a ball, she was looking to the skies and praying for dragons to come swooping down onto the grounds. Violet had never known so many people to put their names down to stay at Hogwarts for Christmas. She always did, of course, because the alternative was going back to Privet Drive. But she and Harry had always been very much in the minority before now. This year, however, everyone in the fourth year and above seemed to be staying, and they all seemed to Violet to be obsessed with the coming ball. At least all the girls were, Tracy included. The boys were in a state of excitement as well, but for apparently different reasons. It was amazing how many boys Hogwarts suddenly seemed to hold. She had never quite noticed that before. Moving in groups throughout the halls, their haunted eyes flicking quickly away from any girls that might be gathered near them, whispering frantically to one another over the table, sharing panicked tips on how best to approach girls and speak to girls, and how to style their hair so that girls might be more inclined to like them. Oh, he's well fit, Tracy muttered, throwing a glance over her shoulder at a tall fifth-year Ravenclaw boy, who looked to have so much product in his hair that Violet thought he might combust if he got too near a torch. Quick, Roman 6, try to catch his eye, maybe he'll come over here. But any boys coming over to her was exactly the sort of thing Violet was hoping to avoid. Just the thought of it made her vaguely queasy. Why do I have to get his attention? She whined, nonetheless flashing a nervous smile in the boy's direction. Because you're the pretty one, you know that, Tracy hissed, thwacking a sputtering Violet on the arm for good measure. You'll have boys queuing up to ask you to the ball, but if you say no, maybe they'll notice me next. As mortified as Violet was by this sentiment, Tracy wasn't wrong. Though the Ravenclaw boy didn't seem entranced by her smile, too many teeth, you look a bit feral, Tracy coached seriously. There seemed to be a never-ending stream of boys seeking Violet's attention. The first was a curly-haired Durmstrang boy to whom Violet had never spoken in her life. He marched straight up to her in the entrance hall, bowed curtly, and said in a thick accent, "You will dance with me." "Oh no," Violet said at once, too startled to really think about it. The boy just bowed again, then walked back to his group of other young men from Durmstrang, all of whom took turns firmly patting him on the back. Tracy was furious. "What did you say no for?" she demanded, pinching Violet hard on the arm. "What was wrong with him?" "I don't know who he is," Violet protested, rubbing the sore spot. "I've never even seen him before, Tracy. What was I supposed to say?" Tracy made a disgruntled sort of scoff and looked away, eyeing the group of Durmstrang boys hopefully. "Just give the next one a chance, will you?" But Violet did not give the next boy a chance, because the next boy was an extremely nervous Theodore Knott, who presented her with a slightly wilted bouquet of real violets and stammered all through his brief, poetic speech. He looked crushed when Violet turned him down, and she felt terrible guilty after having done so, but she knew Theodore well enough to be sure she didn't want anything more than acquaintanceship with him. Tracy, mercifully, did not complain. 5 more boys approached Violet over the next 2 days, 3 fellow Hogwarts students, a willowy boy from Beauxbatons, and another one from Durmstrang, and after turning down all of them, Violet was considering never leaving the safety of her dormitory ever again. "They won't leave me alone," she wailed to Tracy, her voice muffled by the pillow she was holding over her face. "I can't take 2 steps without somebody ambushing me. getting in my face about wanting to dance with me. I've never spoken to any of these people before, Tracy. How do they even know me? Suppose it's because you're famous, isn't it? Tracy said disinterestedly, not looking at Violet. She was flipping through a Muggle magazine like the ones Aunt Petunia liked the browse at the supermarket, with some crying American woman on the cover. Must be awful, having people fawn over you all the time. Violet kept her complaining to a minimum after that. Not a single person had asked Tracy to the ball yet, and with each passing invitation that Violet got, she could see the hurt and jealousy building up behind her best friend's eyes. Worst of all, Tracy had no one else to commiserate with. Cass was in the same boat as Violet. Victor Crumb was no longer the only one, with a small army of giggling girls following behind him at all hours of the day. Every time they saw Cass, he was being approached by a different smiling girl wanting him to take her to the dance, and some of them weren't inclined to take no for an answer. A very pretty girl from Beauxbatons caused a scene in the courtyard, jamming her finger into Cass's chest while yelling at him in French. He was left red-faced and flabbergasted and didn't appear at meals for the next 3 days. The last week of term became increasingly boisterous as it progressed. Rumors about the Yule Ball were flying everywhere, though Violet didn't believe half of them. For instance, that Dumbledore had bought 800 barrels of mulled mead from Madame Rosmerta. It seemed to be fact, however, that he had booked the Weird Sisters. Exactly who or what the Weird Sisters were, Violet didn't know, never having had access to a wizard's wireless, but she deduced from the wild excitement of those who had grown up listening to the WNN, Wizarding Wireless Network, that they were a very famous musical group. Some of the teachers, like little Professor Flitwick, gave up trying to teach them much when their minds were so clearly elsewhere. He allowed them to play games in his lesson on Wednesday and spent most of it fielding questions from students who eagerly and very suddenly wanted to learn about enchanting charms. Other teachers were not so generous. Nothing would ever deflect Professor Binns, for example, from ploughing on through his note on goblin rebellions, as Binns hadn't let his own death stand in the way of continuing to teach. They supposed a small thing like Christmas wasn't going to put him off. It was amazing how he could make even bloody and vicious goblin riots sound as boring as Percy's Cauldron Bottom report. Professors McGonagall and Moody kept them working until the very last second of their classes too, and Professor Snape, of course, would no sooner let them play games in class than offer to adopt Harry. Staring sternly around at them all, he informed them that he would be testing them on poison antidotes during the last lesson of the term. "Cruel, he is," said Tracy bitterly that night in the Slytherin common room. "Setting a test on us on the last day, ruining the last bit of term with a whole load of studying. If there's anyone who could do with a bit of dancing, it's Snape." Violet snorted and nearly choked on the end of her lime-flavored sugar quill, which she was sucking as she perused her potions notes. Who would want to dance with him? "I know, right?" Tracy said, grinning at her for the first time in days. "He'd probably just stand there, glaring, don't you think? Or worse, what if he's actually a really good dancer?" "Could you imagine?" Tracy let out a shriek of laughter, and suddenly it was as though the last week had never happened. All the tension and jealousy bled away, and they were back to giggling and teasing and just being friends again. "What's so funny?" asked a familiar voice. Tracy and Violet looked up in greeting as Cassius flopped into the chair across from them. The golden egg which he had been carrying everywhere with him since the day he got it landed on the table with a dull thunk. "Snape dancing," the girls said together, and broke into giggles again. Cass's face scrunched up as though he'd just sucked on a lemon. "Oh, Merlin's arse, don't make me think about that, not so close to Christmas." Tracy and Violet cackled some more, only stopping when Cass threatened to get up and leave again. "Have you made any progress with it?" Violet asked, tapping the golden egg with the tip of her finger. Cass heaved a long-suffering sigh. "Not a bit." "I've been listening to it," he said, frowning at the thing, "trying to see if there's a hidden message or a code or something, but the only thing that's gotten me is a headache. My ears wouldn't stop ringing all morning." But you are going to keep working on, aren't you? Tracy said anxiously. Course I am. I've only got 2 months, you know. I know, but don't want to be left out, do you? What if everyone else has already figured it out by now, and you're the only one who hasn't? Don't be ridiculous, Cass said, but there was a frantic, nervous sort of look in his eyes. What, do you know something? Has somebody figured it out already? He turned to Violet. Hashra figured it out. Not that I know of, said Violet. I mean, I haven't had a chance to talk him lately with all the chaos going on. Cass visibly relaxed. Okay. But you'd tell me if he had, wouldn't you? Of course, Cass, she assured him. Just like I'd tell Harry straight away if you figure it out before he does. Right, right. I suppose that's fair. Speaking of chaos, have you had any more hopeful suitors today, Romans 6? Violet wrinkled her nose at him. Only 2, she admitted reluctantly. I thought I saw Adrian Pusey eyeing me down the table at dinner, but I didn't hang around long enough to give him a chance. Wise of you, Cass said, nodding. Not that he's a bad bloke, mind, just well, if you're waiting for that special someone, let's just say you can do a lot better than him. What are you waiting for? Tracy asked suddenly, eyes narrowed suspiciously at her. I didn't think you even fancied anyone, Romans 6. I don't, Violet said, a little too quickly, though she did mean it, mostly. Then what do you keep turning people down for? Don't you want to go to the ball? I do, Violet insisted. I'm already nervous about having to dance in front of everybody, you know, and the last thing I want to do is spend the whole night with someone I don't even fancy. But who'd you fancy? No one, Violet said out loud. You said, a little voice in the back of her mind before she could shut it up. Violet felt her face going red. Unable to bear Tracy's accusatory stare, she rounded on Cassius. What about you, then? What about me, what? Have you had any more admirers demand your affection lately? Cass grimaced unhappily. Not today, thankfully. I've been ducking in and out of classrooms any time I see anyone from Beauxbatons, just to be safe. Oh, how horrible it must be for you both, Tracy said loudly, having to fight off crowds of people who want to date you. I mean, I can't imagine how bad that could possibly be. The bitterness in her voice was impossible to miss, and both Cass and Violet looked away, abashed. Haven't you had people asking you as well? Cass asked. Tracy shook her head. Nope. Not a one, she said brightly, though her smile was too sharp to be genuine. Maybe I'll get lucky and someone I know or fancy will ask me at the last minute. Or maybe I'll get stuck with someone horrible like Goyle. Or maybe I won't even get asked at all, and I'll just have to stand on the sidelines and watch everybody else having a good time without me. I thought maybe, said. Tracy cut herself off abruptly, but there was no doubt about whose name she'd nearly said. Cedric Diggory, the seeker of the Hufflepuff Quidditch team. Tracy had carried a rather obvious torch for him ever since they had literally run into one another the year before. The fact that he had stopped to help her pick up her things and taken the time at all to speak kindly with her had clearly left a lasting impression. Tracy pursed her lips and took a deep breath. Not that it matters, she said, primly smoothing down the front of her robes. I don't need a partner. It's not like I know how to dance anyways. I can just go by myself, alone, and enjoy the music. You won't be alone, Violet said vehemently. She reached across the table and grabbed hold of Tracy's hand, squeezing tightly. I'm sure you'll be asked, Tracy, because you're wonderful, and I can't believe that everyone in this school is too stupid to see that. And besides, she went on more loudly, because Tracy had opened her mouth to protest, even if you don't end up with a partner, I'll bear with you. And we'll make a brilliant bloody time of it, I promise. Tracy did smile, which was kind of her, but Violet could see that there wasn't much happiness in it all. That's really sweet of you, Romans 6, Tracy said. She gently patted the back of Violet's hand, only to pull out of reach a moment later. But it just wouldn't be the same. The Hogwarts staff, demonstrating a continued desire to impress the visitors from Beauxbatons and Durmstrang, seemed determined to show the castle at its best this Christmas. When the decorations went up, Violet noticed that they were the most stunning she had yet seen inside the school. Everlasting icicles had been attached to the banisters of the marble staircase. The usual 12 Christmas trees in the great hall were bedecked with everything from luminous holly berries to real, hooting, golden owls, and the suits of armor had all been bewitched to sing carols whenever anyone passed them. It was quite something to hear, "O come, all ye faithful," sung by an empty helmet that only knew half the words. Several times, Filch the caretaker had to extract Peeves from inside the armor, which he had taken to hiding in, filling in the gaps in the song lyrics, which lyrics of his own invention, all of which were very rude. While Violet still hadn't accepted a single invitation, she was stunned to learn that Harry hadn't even asked Anione yet. "But you're one of the champions," Violet said when he told her, frantically, over breakfast. "You're supposed to pen the whole ball." "I know," Harry hissed. "I know, you don't need to tell me that. It's bad enough, with McGonagall giving me these looks like I'm a disappointment to her personally." "Isn't there someone you want to go with?" Violet asked. "What about the Ravenclaw seeker, what's her name?" "Cho Chang," said Harry at once, and then shut his mouth with a snap. His face had gone very red. She's all right, I suppose, Soska. I will, all right, just I don't want to seem too keen or make a fool of myself or anything." "What if she says no? Then I'll look like a right idiot," said Harry miserably. He looked at Violet suddenly, eyes narrowing. "What about you? Ron says you've been asked by loads of blokes." "What does Ron know about it?" Violet asked. Then, slightly panicked, "He's not planning to ask me to the dance, is he?" "Not that I'm aware of, but actually." Harry glanced quickly around them, then leaned in and said, "Ron hasn't got a date yet." He tried asking Fleur de Lac, Violet, who had just taken a sip of pumpkin juice, sprayed rather a lot of it out through her nose. "I know, it was horrible. He's been hiding in the common room for hours, but if you haven't agreed to go with anyone yet, maybe." "I'd rather not," Violet said delicately, even as her brother fixed her with his most pleading stare. "It's not that I don't like him. Ron's all right. He's funny and all, but I don't feel that way about him, Harry, and I really don't think he feels anything special towards me either." Harry deflated slightly, but nodded. "I suppose you're right. He tried to ask Hermione too, you know." "Tried? Didn't she say yes?" Harry shook his head. "Said she's already going with someone, but she won't tell us who. Do you know anything about it?" "No." "Oh, but actually," Violet had just been struck with an idea. "Tracy doesn't have a date to the ball either. Nobody's asked her at all, and she's really upset about it. Maybe Ron could. Or you, if you don't get around to asking Cho, that is." "I'm going to ask Cho," Harry said through gritted teeth. He looked around again, seeming to think something over. Finally, he nodded. "All right, I'll talk to Ron about asking Tracy. She's pretty enough, so he shouldn't complain too much." "She's gorgeous." Violet wanted to protest, suddenly and irrationally angry. "She's brilliant and wonderful, and Ron Weasley can sod off into the lake if he doesn't think she's good enough for him." Violet said none of this out loud. Instead, she forced her face into a hopeful smile, said goodbye to her brother, and hurried off to Charms with a mess of conflicted thoughts floating around in her head. On the one hand, she very much wanted Tracy to be happy, and being asked to the Yule Ball would make her very happy indeed. On the other hand, the hand that Violet was trying and failing to keep tied behind her back, well out of sight, she wanted to be the one to take Tracy to the ball, even if it was only in a friendly sort of way. Last year, when Violet had kissed her in the Hogsmeade Gardens, Tracy had politely yet very firmly told her that she just didn't think of Violet that way. Tracy liked boys, and only boys, while Violet wasn't sure at all what she liked. She must like girls, because she liked Tracy very much, and she'd been so entranced by the dancing villa, and the way Fleur de Lacquer's hair shimmered with every little movement she made. But she also liked the look of Bill Weasley, with his earring and long hair, and she'd found most of the boys who'd asked her to the dance to be quite attractive, really, aside from the fact that she didn't know them. It was all very confusing to think about, and she always ended up crying whenever she did. So Violet had resolved not to think about any of it any more at all, ever, and with luck, everything would sort itself out before she could embarrass herself further. When Charms let out another fun, highly unproductive lesson, Violet hurried off toward ancient ruins on the 6th floor, her head still very much in a fog of anxiety. She was so distracted with not thinking about how pretty Tracy's eyes were in the sunlight that she wasn't paying attention to what was in front of her. She just rounded a corner on the 4th floor when she collided very hard with something solid. "Oof," said the thing, which turned out to be Lee Jordan, who had to windmill his arms to stop from falling over. Luckily, he was caught by Fred Weasley, who said, "Watch yourself, Lee. You almost trampled poor Violet." "Oh yeah, poor Violet," said Lee, grinning as he regained his balance. "Sorry about that, Potter. Don't know my own strength sometimes." "I'm so sorry," Violet said. She was red in the face, but completely unharmed. Lee had clearly come out worse in their collision. I wasn't looking where I was headed. No harm done," said George, reaching over Fred to pat Lee hard on the shoulder. "Sides, I don't think a little more damage would make a difference on this mug." "Hush, Weasley," said Lee. "And coming from you, two can't imagine how hard it is, being the ugly twin." The three of them laughed, grinning and hitting each other jovially on the arms as they headed on their way. George, however, seemed reluctant to join his twin and friend. "I'll catch up, yeah," he said to them. Lee just waved, but Violet didn't miss the meaningful sort of look that passed between him and Fred. But Fred, too, waved and continued on his way, leaving George and Violet alone together in the hall. "Where are you headed to?" George asked, nodding to the small stack of books Violet held in her arms. "Ancient runes," she said. "You, potions," said George with a grimace, "but I'm thinking of skiving off. Professor Snape won't like that very much." "The greasy old git doesn't like much of anything, does he?" George said, and then smirked. "Other than a few specials little swats like yourself." "I'm not a swat," Violet protested. "Hermione's a swat. I just happen to be good at what he teaches." George laughed. "Yeah, all right, if it makes you feel better." He cleared his throat suddenly and said, "So, the ball's coming up, you excited?" "Nervous, more like," Violet said honestly. "I've never danced in front of anyone before, so I'll probably make a fool of myself." "Hooray you taking?" "Depends." "Hooray you going with?" No one," Violet said, confused. "Depends on what?" "Whether or not you were already going with someone," said George. There was a small, sheepish sort of smile on his face as he looked at her. "But since you aren't." "How about it? How about?" The pieces clicked together in Violet's head. Oh, you mean go with you. To the ball." George raised his eyebrows hopefully, still smiling, and Violet felt a very funny sort of flutter in her chest. She remembered, all in a sudden rush, that terrible night at the Quidditch World Cup. George had stayed with her when she'd run off to find Harry, tried to protect her, loaned her his sweater, which her face grew hot to recall had been very warm and smelled very nice. George was not, as Violet had complained about all the other boys who'd approached her over the last week, a stranger. His brown eyes were warm and familiar, and currently filling with worry because, as Violet realized, she'd just been staring at him in silence without actually giving any sort of answer. "Yeah," she heard herself say, in a breathy sort of voice that was very unlike her own. "Yeah, I'll go with you." "Yeah," repeated George, and his voice sounded all high and funny as well. He blinked, then cleared his throat loudly and said, Great. I'll, see you Christmas then." There was a bit of confusion as the two of them tried to walk around each other, only to end up blocking one another's path. After the third unsuccessful attempt, George puts his hands on Violet's shoulders and spun around, switching their places. "There," he said, grinning broadly. Oh, and he leaned in suddenly, before Violet could react, and planted a quick kiss on her cheek, and then he was running away. "Have fun in class," George called over his shoulder from halfway down the corridor. Violet, stunned and speechless, remained standing there, hand to her cheek, until the bell rang, signaling that she was late for class. Violet floated mindlessly all those ancient runes, not retaining a single word that Professor Babbling said. When the bell rang again, and Violet looked down at her notes, she could barely make sense of any of the scribbles she had apparently copied down. However, the word George was clearly written no less than 3 times across her parchment, and Violet, mortified, stuffed the whole thing into the bottom of her bag before anyone else could see. For the first time in weeks, Violet wasn't bothered by all the giggling and whispering going on in the halls on her way to lunch. She barely heard it. Really, the birds were singing some lovely little songs outside, Violet thought to herself. And had the sun always shone so brightly and so warmly through the castle windows? She was so distracted by her whimsical new perception of the world that she didn't even hear her own name being called. "Hey," said Cassius, making her jump as his hand landed on her shoulder. He looked windswept and out of breath, and there was a fresh cut near his hairline. "What are you ignoring me for?" "I wasn't," Violet said, staring up at the bleeding gash on his forehead. "What happened there?" "Hagrid's class," said Cass. He raised a hand to prod the cut and winced. "Don't worry about it, it's fine. Can I talk to you for a minute?" Nodding, Violet allowed herself to be pulled off to the side of the bustling crowd. Groups of girls were still gathered together, laughing and smiling, while all the boys around them looked as though they were about to either faint or combust. She followed Cass out of the main corridor entirely and into a narrow side passage. There was a portrait of a very elderly witch snoozing against her frame on the wall, and she didn't so much as twitch in her sleep as Cassius began to talk. "So I probably should have gotten a move on already," he started. "I know I'm cutting it close and all, but I wasn't sure at first if that's what you were doing. And then I had to think about though, and I had this big elaborate plan all set up, only then you and Tracy were all upset about the house elves, so I had to tell them off and start over. I wanted to do something special, because it's you. But then I thought," he gave a funny little laugh, "well, it is you. And in you, and it wouldn't really need to be something big and flashy, since you hate that sort of thing. But I knew I had to do it soon somehow, just because." Cass was rambling in a very un-Cass-like manner. Violet had never seen him like this, and she hadn't the faintest idea what he was going on about. "Hang on, stop," she said, putting a hand up to shush him. "What's this got to do with me? You had to dow it soon." Cass blinked, looking at her like she's just told him she didn't believe in the moon. "Ask you to the ball, of course," he said. Violet gaped at him. "WH what?" "I know, I've been overthinking it for days," he said, laughing again. "I should have just gotten it over with and put us both out of our misery, but I'll admit it was a bit fun hearing you tell off lad after lad, making up all sorts of excuses for why they weren't good enough. Guess they'll figure it out eventually once they see us." Violet still didn't understand what was going on. Cass was leaning against the wall, casual as they come, smiling at her like she was his accomplice in some grand scheme that the two of them had been running. "See us," she said faintly. "Dancing," said Cassius. "They'll realize why they never had a chance." A distant ringing had began in Violet's ears, like the tinkle of a bell heard from the back of a shop. But her throat stuck together, and she really had to work to unstick it. "But I'm going with George," Cass snorted. "Weasley, yeah, all right, and I suppose I'm going with Katie Bell then. Good one, though." Cass was laughing, but Violet didn't join him. She was starting to feel very sick. "Cass, I wasn't kidding," Violet said slowly. "I'm really going with George." His smile took on a slightly fixed quality. "What? He asked me earlier," Violet muttered. "I said yes." Cass stared at her, that horrible smile stuck on his face. "What?" he said again, voice cracking. "But hold on, I thought beauty." He ran a hand across his forehead, smearing a bit of drying blood into his hair and opening the cut again. He looked to be thinking very hard about something. "You kept saying no," Cass said slowly, "to everyone for weeks. And I figured, you basically said, the other night with Tracy, and I was right there." "What are you talking about?" Violet asked, only feeling more bewildered by the second. "You were waiting," said Cass. "You said you were waiting for someone to ask you, and I thought that's what you were doing, but I wasn't sure." "I said I wasn't waiting for anyone." "No, I know, but you said it, like girls do when they mean something else, when girls what?" "But then what was it all for?" Cass said, starting to sound angry. Weren't you waiting for me? Why would I be waiting for you? Violet said, growing angry as well, just from all the confusion and laughing. Cass jerked back as though she'd slapped him. Because I thought you wanted to, he said, blinking at her. I mean, I thought you felt. There was a great snore from the sleeping witch portrait, making both of them jump. Cass's face and neck had both gone very red, and his mouth was hanging open, lips working faintly as though sounding out silent words. Violet could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears, mingling with the now constant ringing. She and Cassius stared at each other, both fuming, both utterly bewildered by the other's behavior. It was a tense, unpleasant scene. Right, Cass said with finality. He sniffed sharply and straightened up. I suppose I was mistaken. And then he turned on his heel and marched away, leaving Violet standing in the corridor by herself. She could hear the muffled movement of the crowds, still moving through the main hallway, chatting and laughing and carrying on with their lives, completely oblivious to the small, private struggle that had just taken place. Violet was angry. She was angry and confused and hurt, and just when she had been so happily moments before. What was Cass playing at? Why did he have to go and behave that way, saying those things, acting like he was the one who had a right to be thunderstruck? What right did he have to be mad at her? And what right did he have to make her feel so wretched? As usual, Violet wasn't sure exactly when she'd started crying, but she hoped it was after Cass had gone. She didn't want him to see her tears, didn't want to give him the satisfaction of having caused them, more like. And now she was trapped. There was no way out of the side passage she was tucked into that didn't lead into a crowd of people. They would see her and know something had happened. Someone would see her, see the state of her and the look on her face, and they would say something, because they always did. Bloody hell, Potter's crying again, heard so many times, always followed by who did it this time. And did she ever stop in the first place? And looks like you owe me another sickle. It was humiliating. And it was exhausting, breaking down all the time, spending the time it took to get her breathing under control and clean up all the tears and snot and everything else. How many hours of her short life had been wasted curled into a ball and sobbing her eyes out? How many more was she going to waste over a boy of all things? She couldn't do it. Not this time, not over something so simple, so stupid and silly and mundane. It wasn't fair. It wasn't fair at all. Violet covered her eyes with her hands, pressing into them with the heels of her palms until spots of color bloomed behind her eyelids like fireworks. She held her breath to stop from crying and counted, keeping the air inside of her until it ached too much to bear. She gasped and immediately felt lightheaded, but better. So she did it again. By the time the bell rang signaling the end of lunch, Violet felt sufficiently numb to show her face again, tear-stained though it still was. She scrubbed her cheeks with the sleeve of her robes before slipping out of the alcove, doing her best to blend in with the thinning crowd on her trek down to the dungeons. She hoped her eyes would lose some of their redness along the way. Most of the class was already gathered outside of Professor Snape's classroom. Harry waved when he caught sight of her, his expression quickly becoming concerned when he saw her face. Violet only waved back and shook her head, hoping he'd leave it be. The last thing she wanted was for anyone in her house to know she'd been crying again. Romans 6. Violet jumped about a foot as Tracy latched onto her arm from behind and swung her around. She was positively beaming. Romans 6, you'll never guess what happened, you'll never guess, Tracy whispered, her voice bubbling with excitement. Go on, try. Violet, still emotionally shell-shocked, wasn't prepared for this level of exuberance. She said stupidly. A flash of red hair over Tracy's shoulder tripped something in her memory. You got asked to the ball. Tracy's smile grew even wider, showing off her newly straightened teeth. Yes, she squealed, bouncing on the balls of her feet. But you'll really never guess by who, not in a million years. Violet's eyes darted back to the red hair. Ron was standing next to Harry, idly digging something out of his ear. Ah, Violet said. If she guessed right, would Tracy know she'd set the whole thing up? Would she be angry with Violet too? but Tracy's excitement was too fierce to be contained. "I'll just tell you, because you'll really never get it," she said, leaning in, eyes twinkling. "Are you ready?" Violet nodded and mentally planned out how surprised she should make her face look. Tracy looked around conspiratorially, did a funny sort of wiggle with her shoulders, and said, "I'm going to the ball with Cass." Violet froze. It felt, suddenly, as though all of her insides had vanished. "Inno," Tracy squeaked, seeing the stunned look on Violet's face. I couldn't believe it either. It just happened, too. During lunch he came in late, looking all funny, and I could tell right away he was nervous, of course. And when I asked what was wrong, he just asked me. Just blurted it right out. He said he'd been thinking about it for weeks and weeks, but couldn't pluck up the courage. And he wanted to do it just right, but since it was me, he said, he knew he didn't need to do anything fancy, because, oh, Violet, I'm so excited. All this time he's felt this way, and I never knew. Can you believe it? No, Violet said faintly. As Tracy rambled, her insides had come back. They were now made of lead. No, I can't, that's. She swallowed the hard, jagged lump that now sat in her throat and forced what she really hoped was a genuine-looking smile. That's wonderful, Tracy. Fortunately, Violet was spared having to lie any more by the classroom door opening, and Professor Snape ushered them all inside with a nasty smile in his face. The numbness from before was the only thing keeping her functional. Violet's body felt as though it was working on automatic, with no input from her mind whatsoever, all through the potions test. She could see her hands moving, chopping and stirring, but she couldn't feel them at all. Her legs and feet held her up, but they were cold and numb beneath her. The only part of her body that had any sensation at all was a point in the very middle of her chest, which felt like a ragged, gaping hole had been torn through it, leaving a hollow space where her heart used to be. It hurt, worse than before somehow. It was a constant, dull, and hollow ache that didn't lessen at all as the hours ticked by. She barely heard it when Professor Snape gave her full marks, praising her technique aloud to the whole class. Barely noticed when Tracy handed her bag to her. Barely felt it when Malfoy tried to trip her as she walked past. Violet's body wandered out of the dungeons, carrying her along with it, and she didn't really awaken again until they arrived in the Great Hall. "There he is," Tracy hissed, shaking Violet out of her numbness. "Should I sit next to him? Is that too much?" Violet's eyes followed where Tracy was pointing. Cass was sitting at the Slytherin table, staring down at the empty plate in front of him. He looked paler than usual. "Do what you like," Violet heard herself say. An idea had just sprouted in the back of her mind. "I think I'll sit with George, actually." "George," Tracy repeated, looking at her with wide eyes. "George Weasley, what for? He asked me to the ball today." Tracy sputtered for a moment, then gave Violet a gentle whack on the arm. "You should have said something," Tracy cried. "Letting me go on and on about Cass, I mean Roman 6, that's adorable. I'm so happy for you. Go on, I think he's waving at you." George was indeed waving, and Violet wasted no time in marching over to the Gryffindor table and making room for herself. She smiled prettily as Fred and George greeted her, and laughed at the startled, slightly affronted look on Harry's face when she explained what she was doing there. Violet could feel eyes on her from across the hall. She felt them boring into her as soon as she sat down, as she ate, as she laughed and smiled, and made a show of enjoying herself. When George slipped his arm around her shoulders, gently pulling her closer to him, Violet thought the eyes might burn straight through her. But her back was to the Slytherin table, where Cass and Tracy sat, and where she was certain the vicious gaze was coming from. She didn't look back once. Chapter 19. The Yule Ball. Despite the very heavy workload of homework that the fourth years had been given for the holidays, Violet was determined to pace herself with it when term ended, and tried to spend the week leading up to Christmas enjoying herself as fully as possible, along with everyone else. The Slytherin dungeons were hardly less crowded now than during term time. They seemed to have shrunk slightly too, and their inhabitants were being so much rowdier than usual. The Quidditch team, without any games to prepare for, had invented the new sport of land quidditch, which mostly involved hurling a quaffle at each other as hard as possible and scoring points by hitting unsuspecting bystanders in the face. This was stopped, fortunately, by Professor Snape, who had been approached by a very annoyed Madame Pomfrey. She'd treated one too many bloody noses lately and wanted it dealt with. Snow was falling thickly upon the castle and its grounds now. The pale blue Beauxbaton's carriage looked like a large, chilly, frosted pumpkin next to the iced gingerbread house that was Hagrid's cabin, while the Durmstrang ship's portholes were glazed with ice, the rigging white with frost. The house elves down in the kitchen were outdoing themselves with a series of rich, warming stews and savory puddings. Violet had been making a habit of sneaking down to check up on them every few days, now that she knew how. She hadn't convinced any of them to stop bowing at her yet, but it was worth the effort. Violet had found herself doing a lot more sneaking than usual as of late, most of it with George, and sometimes with Fred and Lee as well. Weasley's wizard wheezes were still well underway. She was delighted to learn the twins had branched out from simple toffees to what they called canary creams, which had the hilarious effect of turning whoever ate them into a large, bright yellow canary for a few moments. It was a shock the first time Violet fell for it, but once her feathers molted, she was able to laugh along with the others. The creams had apparently been a huge success among the Gryffindors, and they were now hoping to start pushing them to the other houses as well. George also confided to her that they were now working on something else, but only winked dramatically when she excitedly asked what. Spending time with George was an unexpected breath of fresh air. Violet loved her friends dearly, but for the last week she'd been unable to stomach the sight of them. Cass was acting like nothing had happened between the two of them. Like he hadn't completely read her perception of their friendship and on the thing that Violet was most desperate to do, in the laziest, cruelest way possible. The problem was not that he had asked Tracy to the ball, except that it was, but that he had apparently done so with the exact same speech he had given to Violet. Was anything he'd said real? As badly as she wanted to know the truth, Violet found that her nerve had failed her yet again. The first time she managed to look Cassius in the eye after their conversation, all the courage she'd been working up that morning leaked out of her at once, leaving her jelly-legged and stammering. If Cass had noticed her fit of distress, he did an admirable job of ignoring it. He just smiled and went on chatting about his plans for the day, which Tracy was eagerly listening to. Tracy did a lot of things eagerly around Cass now, Violet noted with a familiar hollow feeling in her gut. Every time Cass spoke, Tracy would stop what she was doing and listen attentively, smiling and laughing whenever he said anything remotely funny. Tracy hadn't sat next to Violet in days. Her new place was on the other side of the table, pushed right up next to Cass's side. If she wasn't able to hold his hand, then she would twine their arms together, or their ankles beneath the table, as Violet learned by accident when she bent to pick up her dropped fork. Watching all of this new affection bloom between her friends should have made Violet happy. She argued to herself a good friend would be supportive, no matter their own feelings, surely, but it had the distinctly opposite effect of making her sick, sad, and furious all at once. She couldn't decide who she was more upset with. Cass, for making her question everything about their friendship, and who had reused the same lines on Tracy, whether he meant any of it or not. Or Tracy, who not only ate up Cass's words with gluttonous enthusiasm, but also seemed to delight in the little intimacies with him that Violet so desperately wanted to share with her. Guts churning and bitter tears constantly pricking at the corners of her eyes. It was all that Violet could do to be around them day after day, fixing a smile so forced it felt as though her face may crack. Violet awoke very suddenly on Christmas Day. Wondering what had caused this abrupt return to consciousness, she opened her eyes and saw a pair of round, orange eyes staring back at her in the darkness, so close they were almost nose to nose. "Hello, Crooks," Violet said, blinking at the large, very fluffy cat that was currently perched on her chest. "Can I help you?" Crookshanks huffed softly and began to knead at the blankets, his sharp claws prickling through to Violet's skin. "Ouch, Crooks!" groaned Violet, grabbing him round the middle and lifting him off of her. She sat up in bed and settled Crookshanks in her lap, petting him idly as she yawned and stretched. The resulting purrs rumbled all through her, and Crookshanks resumed his kneading at her legs. "What's gotten into you this morning?" Violet asked him sleepily. Her fingers brushed against something rough down his back, and she paused, looking him over more carefully this time. Half hidden beneath all the fur, a bright red ribbon had been loosely tied around Crookshank's neck and knotted into a bow. Violet frowned. "Now who did this to you?" The answer was quickly found. The ribbon had a little paper card attached to it, and Violet tilted her head to read, "Merry Christmas, Violet. I've asked Crookshanks to play messenger boy this morning, and I hope he hasn't gotten into trouble along the way. Unfortunately, I haven't got any more priceless family heirlooms hidden away for you, so I can only hope this meager offering will suffice. You don't have to share if you don't want to. Professor R.J. Lupin, Godfather, Esquire, etc." Violet giggled and checked Crookshank's ribbon again, finding another small package affixed to it. She hastily unwrapped the little box of rich chocolate truffles and popped two into her mouth at once, chewing happily as she went about freeing Crookshanks from his decoration. He hopped down as soon as he was free of it. "You're welcome," Violet called after him, her mouth still thick with chocolate. She startled when her curtains were ripped open a moment later, and there stood Tracy, beaming. "Happy Christmas, Roman 6, she said loudly, and flung herself forward to give Violet a hug. "I was going to let you sleep in, but since you're already up," an armload of presents were dumped into Violet's lap, and the next 10 minutes were spent tearing through tape and wrapping paper, excitedly showing off what new goodies they had both acquired. With the exception of Aunt Petunia's present, a bottle of garish pink nail polish with a large sale sticker slapped on the label Violet's haul was better than it had ever been in her life. Tracy had given her an enormous bag of assorted Muggle sweets and lollies. Sirius had sent a seemingly ordinary coin purse, but when Violet checked to see if there was anything inside, she found her whole arm able to reach inside up to the shoulder. And from Hagrid, another handmade gift, this time a set of earrings, from each of which dangled a bright orange gem of some sort with little black specks trapped inside. Violet, whose ears had been pierced at the age of 5 at Aunt Petunia's insistence, resolved to wear them to the ball, despite the fact they didn't match her dress at all. There was also, of course, Mrs. Weasley's usual package, including a new sweater, grey this time, with a large green V on the front, and a large quantity of homemade mince pies. She'd also sent Violet a bottle of Sleekies, which turned out to be a potion for straightening one's hair. 2 drops will tame even the most bothersome bonnet, the label proclaimed proudly. Violet and Tracy met up with Cass in the common room. Tracy latched onto him at once and squealed in delight when given her present. Violet kept a very neutral smile on her face for the rest of the morning, not looking directly at either of them whenever possible. The 3 of them went to the Great Hall for a magnificent lunch, which included at least 100 turkeys and Christmas pudding, and large piles of Cribbage's wizarding crackers. Violet was helping herself to seconds when George slung himself into the empty seat beside her, handed her a massive box of assorted sweets, and pressed a fat kiss to her cheek. Cass stopped smiling so much after that, and looked downright sour when Violet left the Slytherin table to join George, Harry, and the rest of the Weasleys in a snowball fight out on the grounds. The snow was untouched, except for the deep channels made by the Durmstrang and Beauxbaton students on their way up to the castle. Violet got to take in the beauty of it for about half a minute before a snowball, thrown by her brother, smacked her in the face. After that, it was on. They stayed out there until 5 o'clock, when Tracy came and hollered to Violet and Hermione that it was time to get ready for the ball. "What, you need 3 hours," said Ron, looking at them incredulously and paying for his lapse in concentration when a large snowball, thrown by George, hit him hard in the side of the head. "Who're you going with?" he yelled after Hermione, but she just waved back without a word. "What are you going with?" Violet asked her, stamping the snow and ice from her frozen feet before they stepped inside the castle. "You'd laugh if I told you," Hermione said loftily. Though her cheeks were already flushed from the cold, Violet could have sworn they took on even more color as she headed up the stairs to Gryffindor Tower. Back in the girls' dormitory, Violet and Tracy began the arduous process of getting dressed. Figuring out her dress was the first of many challenges. Mrs. Weasley's hand-me-down gift was even more beautiful now than when she had first seen it. The heavy green fabric had a faint shimmer to it, but the dozens of little pink silk roses sewn to the front looked far too delicate for Violet's liking. She stepped into the dress with the utmost of care and promptly realized that she didn't know how to fasten it up. There were no buttons or zips that Violet could see. Pansy snidely remarked that the dress looked tooled for anything like that, and it wouldn't stay up unless Violet was holding it. It was Susanna who found the laces in the back, and Millicent who was strong enough to pull and tie them into place. With Tracy's help, Violet put some of the sleekies in her hair and was amazed at the transformation. When left unbraided, her hair had always liked to tangle itself into an unruly rat's nest, filled with gnarls and knots that challenged even the hardiest of brushes. As soon as the potion touched it 2 drops, just like the bottle said, Violet's hair relaxed into smooth, straight strands that hung long enough to brush her collarbones. Some of the older girls had taken it upon themselves to help the younger girls with their hair and makeup, and Violet was immediately swooped upon by 3 seventh-years, wielding an alarming assortment of brushes and powders. She was made to close her eyes, then open them to look up, then down, then tilt her head this way and that, all while being prodded and jabbed and painted. One of the girls stood behind her and pulled her newly silky hair into a variety of styles, asking what the other girls, but not Violet, thought of each, before deciding to leave it down about her shoulders, with one side pinned back away from her face. In one of the few moments she was able to get a word in edgewise, Violet suggested, using her mother's silver hair comb to hold it in place. The effect was dazzling. At last the girls stepped back, and a mirror was shoved in Violet's face. She didn't recognize herself. It was the most bizarre feeling. All her life Violet had defined herself by the fact that she looked just like Harry, but now her brother's face was nowhere to be found. Harry's skin wasn't smooth and even, and didn't have any sort of golden glow to it. His eyes had never sparkled with shimmering powders, nor had his eyelashes ever been long and full enough to brush his cheeks, the way hers did now. Harry's lips had certainly been so full, so prominent on his thin face, painted a shade of vivid, vibrant red. For the very first time, Violet didn't see Harry's face staring back at her in the looking glass. It was almost like looking at a stranger, a veripred stranger, but a stranger nonetheless. "Oh, wow," said Tracy's voice, coming from far away. "Roman 6, you look. Wow." Violet turned toward the voice and felt her mouth fall open. Tracy looked stunning. Her hair, styled by another of the older girls, was tightly braided in neat, curved rows against her scalp, while the back was left loose in its natural bouncing curls. Across her forehead, she wore a jeweled headband, dotted with little yellow flowers. Her dress was the color of cream, cinched very flatteringly at the waist, and her lips were painted a soft, shimmering plum color that stood out beautiful with her dark skin. She was staring at Violet in open wonderment, and Violet couldn't help but stare back. "You look beautiful," she blurted, unable to stop herself. Tracy beamed. "Do I?" She did a little twirl, her gown flaring out at the bottom. "I hope Cass thinks so, too." Violet hoped the sudden, sickening lurch of her stomach didn't show on her painted face. She kept on smiling, took Tracy's offered arm with only a minor stab of pain in her chest, and the two of them set off upstairs. The common room looked strange, full of people wearing different colors instead of the usual mass of black. Susanna was in a sleek dress of deepest purple, and Millicent was wearing an uncharacteristically bright shade of blue. Pansy Parkinson was wearing a very frilly pale pink dress, and was already hanging off of Draco Malfoy's arm. Malfoy was wearing dress robes of black velvet with a high collar, which in Violet's opinion made him look like a vicar. He was flanked by Crabbe and Goyle, both wearing green. They resembled moss-colored boulders, and neither of them, Violet was relieved to see, had managed to snare an unfortunate partner. Cassius met them at the top of the stairs. He looked very smart indeed, in robes of pale grey with polished silver buttons down the front. His mouth hung open as the two girls approached. "Merlin's arse, you clean up nice," he said, his voice cracking slightly. Violet noted the way his gaze flicked between them, lingering on her before settling on Tracy with a smile. Tracy, oblivious, affixed herself to his arm at once. "Shall we go up together?" she asked, looking hopefully at Violet. "Oh," Violet said, glancing around for any excusonato do that, and finding nothing. "Sure." The entrance hall was packed with students too, all milling around waiting for 8 o'clock, when the doors to the great hall would be thrown open. Harry and Ron were already gathered, standing with two very beautiful girls that Violet recognized as the Patel twins. Cho Chang was nowhere in sight. Violet waved to her brother and watched him hesitate to wave back, confused, before the recognition hit. "Violet," Harry said loudly, squinting at her. Ron looked around as well, saw her, and made a funny sort of squeak. "Hi," said Violet shyly. Other people were looking over as well, doing double and even triple takes. She was beginning to feel very self-conscious. She nodded to Harry's dress robes, which were a similar shade of green to her dress. Mrs. Weasley must have done that on purpose. "You look nice." "So do you," Harry said, still staring. "I barely recognized you. I mean, you look—" He blinked and shook his head, scanning the crowd around them. I think I saw George over by the doors, if you're looking for him." George was indeed waiting by the doors, standing near Fred and his date, who Violet recognized as Angelina Johnson, a fellow member of the Gryffindor Quidditch team. Fred and Angelina were standing close to one another, chatting and laughing, while George leaned off the side, looking around at the growing crowd. He spotted Violet as she edged her way toward him, and his eyes grew to the size of dinner plates. "Hello," said Violet, smiling anxiously at him. George's robes, like Fred's, were dark brown and looked a little patchy in places, but the bright purple cuffs and lapels had clearly been new additions. There was a real flower pinned to the front of his robes, a violet. "Hello to you, too," George said breathlessly. "Blimey. You look beautiful." Thank you," Violet stammered, immediately blushing. "You too. I mean handsome. You look handsome." George grinned, blushing as well, and muttered, "Thanks." The oak front doors opened, and everyone turned to look as the Durmstrang students entered with Professor Karkaroff. Crumb was at the front of the party, accompanied by now it was Violet doing a double take, her mouth falling open in shock. Hermione. Only it hardly looked like Hermione at all. Her usually bushy hair was now sleek and shiny, like Violet's, and twisted up into an elegant knot at the back of her head. She was wearing the floaty, periwinkle blue dress Mrs. Weasley had given her, and she was holding herself different. Somehow, or maybe, it was merely the absence of the 20 or so books she usually had slung over her back. She looked absolutely, show-stoppingly gorgeous. When she caught Violet's eye in the crowd and waved shyly, her smile was dazzling. Then Professor McGonagall's voice called, "Champions over here, please." The crowd parted to let the champions and their partners through. Professor McGonagall, who was wearing dress robes of red tartan and had arranged a very striking wreath of thistles around the brim of her hat, ushered Harry, Cass, Fleur, and Crumb off to the sides, while everyone else was allowed into the hall. Holding tight to George's arm, Violet moved with the surging crowd into the great hall. A large round table had been erected at the top of the hall, where the judges were sitting. The walls of the hall had all been covered in sparkling silver frost, with hundreds of garlands of mistletoe and ivy crossing the starry black ceiling. The house tables had vanished as well. Instead, there were about 100 smaller, lantern-lit ones, each seating about a dozen people. Violet and George settled down at one, along with Fred, Angelina, and a few other older Gryffindors. When everyone else was seated, Professor McGonagall entered the hall, leading the champions and their partners in a line behind her toward the top table. Dumbledore clapped happily as the champions approached, but Karkaroff wore an unpleasant expression as he watched Krum and Hermione draw nearer. Ludo Bagman, tonight in robes of bright purple with large yellow stars, was clapping as enthusiastically as any of the students, and Madame Maxime, who had changed her usual uniform of black satin for a flowing gown of lavender silk, was applauding them politely. But Mr. Crouch, Violet suddenly realized, was not there. The fifth seat at the table was occupied by Percy Weasley. "Oh, Merlin, look at him," Fred muttered, staring up at Percy with a scowl, who had just pointedly drawn a chair for Harry beside him. "He's going to be insufferable about this 4 years." "Yeah, but look who else is here," said George quietly, nodding further down the table. "Maybe we can have a word later, eh?" Violet followed his eyes to where Ludo Bagman sat, apparently in the middle of telling a joke to Professor Dumbledore. She looked back at George. "What do you want a word with Bagman for? Are you after his autograph or something?" "Or something, yeah," said George. There was a nasty sort of gleam in his eye, but then he blinked and smiled at Violet, and it was gone. "Don't worry about it. Roman 6 dancing with you is still my top priority." Violet blushed and giggled. She feared she was going to be doing a lot of that tonight. There was no food as yet on the glittering golden plates, but small menus were lying in front of each of them. Violet picked hers up uncertainly and looked around. There were no waiters. Fred, however, looked carefully down at his menu, then said very clearly to his plate, "Pork chops," and pork chops appeared. Getting the idea, the rest of the table placed their orders with their plates too. Violet worried, with a pang, about how much extra work this complicated new method of dining must have been for the house elves, but there was nothing that she could do about it now, and she was quite hungry. By the time the dessert menus popped up, Violet was feeling perfectly comfortable, even though she was surrounded on all sides by Gryffindors. Angelina and Alicia Spinnet made polite conversation with her, while Lee and the Weasley twins kept them all laughing all through dinner. At some point, Violet and George's knees had bumped together under the table, and neither of them had moved away yet. For such a small point of contact, it granted immense stability. Violet looked around the hall. Hagrid was sitting with Professors Flitwick and Sprout at one of the staff tables. He was back in his horrible hairy brown suit and gazing up at the top table, where Tracy, Harry, Cass, and Hermione were sat. Violet saw him give a small wave, and looking around, saw Madame Maxime return it, her opals glittering in the candlelight. She was delighted to see Professor Lupin sitting in between Professors Vector and Sinistra, smiling politely at something being said to him. He was wearing a set of black dress robes, which were unfortunately as faded and shabby-looking as everything else he owned, but at least he looked in good health. Violet tried to catch his eye and wave to him, and was slightly miffed when he didn't notice her. "Here we go," said George's voice by her ear, making her jump. She looked around again and saw that Professor Dumbledore had gotten to his feet and was asking for the students to do the same. Then, with a wave of his wand, all the tables zoomed back along the walls, leaving the floor clear, and then he conjured a raised platform into existence along the right wall. A set of drums, several guitars, a lute, a cello, and some bagpipes were set upon it. The Weird Sisters now trooped into the stage to wildly enthusiastic applause. They were all extremely hairy and dressed in black robes that had been carefully ripped and torn. They picked up their instruments and struck up a slow, mournful tune. Stepping onto the brightly lit dance floor, the 4 champions and their partners began to dance. It wasn't nearly as fancy as Violet expected. Harry and Parvati were simply revolving on the spot. Parvati was obviously steering, and the others weren't doing much more than that. Slowly, as the rhythm began to pick up, more couples began stepping onto the dance floor. "Shall we?" said George, offering his hand. Violet, thankful that all the makeup concealed the worst of her blushing, took it and followed him onto the dance floor. She settled her hand on George's shoulder, and he settled his on her waist. A swarm of nervous butterflies erupted in her stomach at the gentle touch, and the two of them joined the solemn dance. They passed Harry and Parvati, and Violet was relieved to see her brother looking just as terrified and overwhelmed as she felt. She was surprised to see Ginny dancing nearby, as well with Neville Longbottom of all people, looking very lovely even as she frequently winced from having her toes trod on, and Professor Dumbledore was waltzing with Madame Maxam. He was so dwarfed by her that the top of his pointed hat barely tickled her chin. However, she moved gracefully for a woman so large. Mad-Eye Moody was doing an extremely ungainly two-step with Professor Sinistra, who was nervously avoiding his wooden leg. Unfortunately, it looked like Violet and Tracy wouldn't get a chance to observe Professor Snape's dancing skills, or lack of them. There was no sign of him on the dance floor, and Violet had only briefly glimpsed him earlier, standing off to the side, wearing his usual black and looking quite bored. But thinking of that night with Tracy, their laughter and easy conversation brought up a dull sort of ache in the middle of Violet's chest. She forced herself not to look at Tracy and Cassius dancing only a half-dozen feet away, beaming at one another. Every now and then she would hear Tracy giggle, and it was all she could do to keep the smile on her face from cracking. Without being obvious about it, she did her best to steer herself and George toward the other side of the crowd. After another revolution around the dance floor, Violet heard the final, quavering note from the bagpipes. The Weird Sisters finally stopped playing, applause filled the hall once more, and a new tune was quickly struck up, this time with a much livelier tempo. "Do you like this one?" George said as the music began to pick up. "I don't know," Violet answered honestly, smiling at him, "but I wouldn't mind another dance." George grinned and adjusted his hand on her waist. By the time the second song ended, both George and Violet were pink in the face from effort. George was a much better dancer than her. "Just do what I do," he'd said, and Violet had tried her best within the confines of her puffy dress. The most remarkable thing was how much fun she was having, despite the crowd and the strange music and the terribly uncomfortable shoes she was wearing. The atmosphere in the great hall was thick with joy and excitement, and it was very easy to ground herself with George's bright smile in front of her. They'd ended up standing very close to one another. George's arm was wrapped almost all the way around Violet's middle, and her hands had clasped themselves together behind his neck. It wasn't until Professor McGonagall danced by with Professor Flitwick, and the two of them very pointedly cleared their throats in their direction, so that George and Violet hastily stepped away from each other. "I'm a bit parched," George said, when the song reached its end. He let go of Violet, leaving her unexpectedly cold. "Fancy a butterbeer." While George went for drinks, Violet looked for a seat. Harry and Ron were sitting at a table with their dates, both of whom were looking unhappy, and Violet set off, hobbling in their direction. "Hey," Violet said a little breathlessly. "Mind if I join you?" Harry grunted noncommittally and gestured to an empty seat. He was looking sullenly onto the dance floor, where plenty of couples were still enthusiastically dancing. Violet sat and followed her brother's gaze to find Cho Chang dancing with her partner, who she recognized with a start as Cedric Diggory. "Are you having a good time?" Violet asked Parvati pointedly. "I'm about to," Parvati muttered, sitting up slightly. A boy from Beauxbatons was approaching, and a moment later had asked her to dance. "You don't mind, do you, Harry?" Parvati said. "What?" said Harry distractedly, without looking at her. "Oh, never mind," snapped Parvati, and she went off with the boy from Beauxbatons. Violet whacked her brother on the arm. "You should have danced with her," she scolded when he looked round at her, annoyed. "You two could have had fun together, I think." Harry finally looked after where his date had gone. She was on the dance floor now, smiling coyly at the Beauxbatons boy. His face fell further. "Oh. Looks like she's having fun now anyways." George appeared suddenly, pushing an ice-cold butterbeer into Violet's hands. "Here," he said distractedly, looking off across the hall. "I'll be right back, all right. Need to talk to Fred about something." Violet opened her mouth to thank him for the drink, but he was already going again, disappearing through the crowd of dancing bodies. She'd barely settled back into her seat when Hermione came over and sat in Parvati's empty chair. She, too, was a bit pink in the face. "Hi," said Harry and Violet. Ron didn't say anything. "It's hot, isn't it?" said Hermione, fanning herself with her hand. "Victor's just gone to get some drinks." Ron gave her a startlingly withering look. "Victor," he said. "Hasn't he asked you to call him Vickiet?" Hermione looked at him in surprise. "What's up with you?" she said. "If you don't know," said Ron scathingly, "I'm not going to tell you." Hermione stared at him, then at Harry, who shrugged. "Ron, what? He's from Durmstrang," spat Ron. "He's competing against Harry, against Hogwarts. You're fraternizing with the enemy, that's what you're doing." Hermione's mouth fell open. Violet rather felt like she should leave. "Don't be stupid," Hermione said after a moment. "Thenemy." Honestly, who was the one who was all excited when they saw him arrive? Who was the one who wanted his autograph? Who's got a model of him up in their dormitory? Ron chose to ignore this. "I suppose he asked you come with him while you were both in the library." "Yes, he did," said Hermione, the pink patches on her cheeks glowing more brightly. "So what? What happened trying to get him to Jointspew, were you?" "No, I wasn't." "If Yorila want to know, he said he'd been coming up to the library every day to try and talk to me, but he hadn't been able to pluck up the courage." Hermione said this very quickly and blushed deeply. "Yeah, well, that's his story," said Ron nastily. "And what's that supposed to mean?" "Obvious, isn't it? He's Karkaroff's student, isn't he? He knows who you hang around with. He's just trying to get closer to Harry, get inside information on him, or get near enough to jinx him." Hermione looked as though Ron had slapped her. When she spoke, her voice quavered. "For your information, he hasn't asked me own single thing about Harry. Not one." Ron changed tack at the speed of light. "Then he's hoping you'll help him find out what his egg means. I suppose you've been putting your heads together during those cozy little library sessions." "I'd never help him work out that egg," said Hermione, looking outraged. "Never. How could you say something like that? I want Harry to win the tournament. Harry knows that, don't you, Harry?" "You've got a funny way of showing it," sneered Ron. "This whole tournament's supposed to be about getting to know foreign wizards and making friends with them," said Hermione hotly. "No, it isn't," shouted Ron. "It's about winning." This was too much for Violet. As soon as Ron raised his voice, she stood up and walked quickly away, hands trembling, toward where she had last seen George disappear. She could still hear Ron and Hermione arguing behind her. "Violet!" She turned around at the questioning voice and found Professor Lupin standing there, looking rather surprised to see her. "Goodness, that is you," Lupin said, smiling as Violet made her way back to him. "I was looking for you earlier, but I don't think I recognized you." "I'm getting that a lot tonight," said Violet sheepishly. "That's a very beautiful dress you're wearing." Violet beamed at him. "Thanks, Mrs. Weasley gave me and Harry our dress robes over the summer. I think everything I'm wearing is either gifted or borrowed, actually. Sarah Gilfil lent me her shoes. I got the earrings from Hagrid this morning, and this is from you, of course." She turned her head to display the gleaming silver flower in her hair. Lupin's eyes widened. "Oh. Oh, that's lovely, Violet. It suits you beautifully." Professor Lupin's voice sounded even hoarser than usual. "I'm so pleased you have an occasion to wear it." "Me too," Violet said. "I've kept it tucked away because I was worried I'd lose it or break it somehow, but wearing it tonight just felt right." Lupin was smiling at her, but there was a look of such complicated emotion behind his eyes that it made her heart clench. It felt, suddenly, very important to Violet that her godfather was getting to see her all dressed like this, in her pretty dress, and wearing makeup for the very first time. The Yule Ball was likely a once-in-a-lifetime experience. That Lupin was here with her mattered very much in a way that she didn't quite know how to express. "Have you been dancing?" she asked. Lupin laughed. "Me? No, no, I have a rather terrible case of two left feet. I wouldn't want to do anyone an injury." He tilted his head slightly. "I believe I saw you dancing earlier, though." "Yeah, with George," said Violet happily. "George Weasley. Did he ask you to the ball?" she nodded, and Lupin made a curious little noise of interest, his eyes suddenly scanning the crowd. Violet felt a twinge of awkwardness. She too cast her eyes around, trying to catch a glimpse of bright orange hair amidst the sea of blonde and brown and black. It wasn't difficult to pick out the handful of redheads. The Weasley twins were stood off to the side of the hall, their eyes on the dance floor, heads bowed, and muttering to one another. Neither of them were smiling. The top table was now empty. Professor Dumbledore was dancing with Professor Sprout, Ludo Bagman with Professor McGonagall. Madame Maxime and Hagrid were cutting a wide path around the dance floor as they waltzed through the students, and Karkaroff was nowhere to be seen. When the next song ended, everybody applauded once more, and Violet saw Ludo Bagman kiss Professor McGonagall's hand and make his way back through the crowds, at which point he was approached by Fred and George. Professor Lupin made another little noise of interest, watching them, but Bagman shook of the twins fairly quickly, however, and disappeared toward the other side of the ballroom. Fred and George stood together for a moment longer, muttering to one another, before shaking their heads and parting ways. Fred headed back to the table where Angelina was sat, while George, spotting Violet through the crowd, made his way over to where she and Lupin stood. "Happy Christmas, sir," said George, grinning at Professor Lupin. "Happy Christmas to you, George," said Lupin, smiling mildly. "Mr. Bagman wasn't giving you any trouble over there, was he?" George's grin slipped slightly. No, sir. We were just trying to get another autograph off him. He's a bit fed up with us, I reckon." He glanced at Violet. Do you fancy another dance? Actually, it's a bit warm in here." Violet was certainly feeling a foreboding sort of flush creep up her neck as Professor Lupin continued to stare at George as though trying to get the measure of him. Could we maybe go for a walk instead?" "Oh, yeah, of course." George offered his arm, and Violet's face flushed even hotter as she took it. "See you later, sir," she muttered without meeting Professor Lupin's eyes. "Take care, you two," said Lupin, still with that same mild smile. "Enjoy your walk." Now feeling as though her head were on fire, Violet tugged on George's arm and pulled him out into the entrance hall. The front doors of the castle still stood open, and she saw that an area of lawn right in front of the castle had been transformed into a sort of grotto full of fairy lights, meaning hundreds of actual living fairies were sitting in the rose bushes that had been conjured there, and fluttering over the statues of what seemed to be Father Christmas and his reindeer. The fluttering fairy lights in the rose garden winked and twinkled as they went down the front steps, where they found themselves surrounded by bushes, winding, ornamental paths, and large stone statues. Violet could hear splashing water, which sounded like a fountain. Here and there, people were sitting on carved benches. She and George set off along one of the winding paths through the rose bushes. "It's beautiful out here," said Violet quietly, watching a train of fairies curling delicately around the shell of a rose. "Not as beautiful as you." Violet's head whipped around to look at George, mouth falling open in surprise. He was staring at her, head tilted so that strands of orange hair were falling into his eyes, which gleamed in the fairy light, and he was looking at her softly. Was it her imagination, or was he leaning closer? Violet quickly turned her head away, heart suddenly pounding. "What were you actually talking to Mr. Bagman about?" she asked hastily, trying to cover her nerves. "You didn't really want his autograph, did you?" "Oh, George straightened up. He had indeed been leaning in a small ways. "No, we just wanted a word with him about our bets from the World Cup. There was a mistake. Well, we thought it was a mistake at first, but the way he's been dodging us about it, we're not so sure anymore, because the I mean," he broke off, awkwardly rubbing at the back of his neck. "Sorry," said George. "It's just, Fred and I haven't really told anyone else about all this. We're handling it, so we don't need anyone's help or anything. Last thing I want is to give you another thing to worry about, you know." "It's all right, you don't have to tell me," Violet said, though now she was even more curious than before. "I trust you two to take care of your own business." "Yeah," said George, grinning crookedly. "Well, that's the first time anyone's ever said that about us. Would you mind writing that in a letter to Mum? Even a postcard would do. Really, I just don't think she'd believe me if I told her." Violet laughed. The butterflies in her stomach dissipated as suddenly as they'd come. That seemed to be the effect George's company had on her, a delightful nervousness that was by turns exhilarating and nauseating with very little downtime in between. No one else had ever made her feel this way. Even with her jumbled feelings toward Tracy, things were still just friendly between them, easy and calm, with just a simple presence of emotion. George made Violet feel many things, but calm was seldom one of them. The two of them had started walking again as they talked, making their way deeper into the maze of rose bushes and fairy lights, leaving the lights and sounds of the castle further and further behind them. As the noise of drums, guitar, and bagpipes faded away, so did the noise of the fountain and the soft chatter of other people in the gardens. She and George were completely alone. Slowly, Violet came to a stop in the middle of the path, and George stopped with her. "You all right?" he asked, his voice slightly too loud for the stillness of the night. "We can head back if you're cold. Blimey, look at you. I forgot you didn't have any sleeves on. I'm all right," Violet said quickly, and meant it. She was close to burning up. "I'm used to the cold. The dungeons can get pretty chilly in the winter. This isn't bad at all." "Oh, I mean, that's good then that you're not cold. I wouldn't want you to be, cold." George was staring at her again. He swallowed audibly. "Bloody hell, but you are a beautiful Violet." Immediately, Violet's face grew so hot she was sure that steam must be coming off of it in the cool night air. She ducked her head, trying to hide the terrible blush, and then gasped when George reached up and brushed his fingers against her chin. "You always do that," he said, gently tilting her face up so that he could see her again. "Try and turtle up when you get embarrassed. It's kind of adorable, you know." Violet let out a small, shaky laugh. She and George were very close together again, almost closer than they had been while dancing. There was no Flitwick or McGonagall nearby to come and tell them off this time. Now, there was nobody else around at all. Slowly, George leaned toward her again, and this time Violet did not pull away. As soon as their lips met, the butterflies in Violet's stomach erupted into fireworks. George had kissed her before, on the cheek, the forehead, once at the very corner of her mouth, but only because she had turned her head by accident. He had never kissed her like this before. Violet didn't even know that kisses could like this. It was slightly wet, and their mouths felt unexpectedly sticky against one another, but in the most wonderful of ways. This was nothing at all like the brief, dry peck that Violet had bestowed on Tracy over a year ago, unreturned and over before it had really even begun. When George's tongue brushed against her bottom lip, Violet felt the earth pitch beneath her feet, threatening to buck her off of its surface and send her soaring away into the stars. She grabbed onto George for support, clinging tightly to his shoulder as he wrapped both arms around her waist and pulled her close against him. He was warm, and for some reason it made her shiver even more as she pressed herself closer to his chest. There was a loud bang, and the rose bush next to them exploded. The pair of them yelped in alarm and sprang apart, trying to cover their faces from the leaves and petals now raining down upon them. George cursed loudly as he staggered back and nearly fell. From nearby, they heard a horribly familiar voice say, My, have I interrupted something?" Petrified, Violet peered through her fingers to where Professor Snape was standing, wand drawn. Clearly he had been the cause of the rose bush's eruption. There was a nasty sneer on his thin face. As wrapped up as they were in each other's arms, neither she nor George had heard the sound of footsteps approaching from down the path. Two sets of footsteps had gone unheard. Snape was not alone. Standing beside him, an expression of mocking amusement on his goateed face, was Professor Karkaroff. 10 points from Gryffindor, Mr. Weasley, for indecent behavior," said Snape dryly, tucking his wand back into his pocket, "and another 10 for foul language. And as for you, miss..." Snape's eyes flicked to her for the first time. Between all the makeup and in way she'd been covering her face, he must not have recognized her at first. When he did, Violet heard him make a sharp, sudden intake of breath. Potter. Violet, who hadn't taken her eyes off of Karkaroff, turned at the sound of her name and found Professor Snape staring at her. He looked startled again, just the same as he had when she'd shouted at him that night in detention, and then his expression became quite closed. Like an eraser had been wiped over his face, Professor Snape's features smoothed to neutral blankness. 20 points from Slytherin, he said flatly, and detention. What she got a detention for? George challenged boldly. Snape's black eyes flicked to him, glinting coldly in the fairy light before settling back on Violet. Get back inside, both you, he snapped instead of answering. Now, they didn't need to be told twice. George grabbed hold of her hand, and the two of them turned and scampered back up the path, gravel crunching loudly underfoot as they hurried back toward the castle. Violet looked back over her shoulder. This turned out to be a mistake, as Professor Snape was watching them go and did not appear to be hearing a word that Karkaroff was saying to him. Violet twisted her head forward again and walked more quickly. That miserable git, George was muttering, taking the steps into the castle 2 at a time. Bet he's having a jolly old time, scaring the pants back onto people just trying to have a little fun. Did Dumbledore tell him to do that, or do you reckon he volunteered? Violet didn't answer. That wonderful rush of warmth had left her completely. She felt cold and humiliated and very small, and the way Professor Snape had stared at her made something hard and foul settle in the middle of her chest. She felt, distressingly, like she had disappointed him somehow. And what gives him the right to put you in detention? George continued. We were both there. I thought he was meant to favor you lot. It's fine, Violet said, finding her voice as they crossed the entrance hall. It's just some points it could have been worse, George Impton muttered. Not hardly. There you are, called a familiar voice. Violet looked up and saw Tracy hurrying toward them. Cassius was behind her, lingering in the doorway of the great hall. I've been looking all over for you. You just disappeared after Tracy stopped short in front of Violet and George. She giggled, a smile spreading across her face. Oh, I see where you went, she said knowingly. I suppose it's best I didn't find you earlier. What are you talking about? Violet said. She looked to George, hoping he might understand better, but oh no. As soon as she looked at George, Violet knew exactly what Tracy had meant. There was a bright red stain smeared across his lips and the skin around his mouth. It was the exact same color as her lipstick. What? Said George, blinking obviously at her. Is there something on my face? Tracy giggled madly. Have you got a handkerchief? She asked. When George shook his head, still looking puzzled, she turned around and called, Cass, can I borrow your handkerchief? It's a bit of an emergency. What happened? Cass asked, hurrying over to them at once. Is someone hurt? Not yet, said Tracy, but I expect they will be if McGonagall catches them going back to the dance looking like that. Just like Tracy, Cass drew up short in front of them. He stared at George's face, looked to Violet, then back at George. His Adam's apple bobbed suddenly, as though he'd just swallowed very hard. Here, he said shortly. He pulled a brilliantly white square of linen from his front pocket and handed it to Tracy, who went to work at once. She pulled a startled George down to her height by the front of his robes, holding him as she wiped the lipstick away. It took a bit of scrubbing, leaving a blood-like stain on the pristine linen. Violet held her breath when it was her turn. It was very conflicting to have Tracy standing just inches away, staring at her mouth, soft fingers gently touching her face. There, Tracy said, jolting Violet back to reality. She admired her handiwork for a moment, declared it satisfactory, and handed the kerchief back to Cass. He clenched the soiled cloth in his fist and stuffed it deep into his pocket. His eyes hadn't left George for a moment. Shall we head back inside? Tracy said brightly, looking up at them all with a smile on her face. I like the sound of the song they're playing. I can't believe I never thought of wizards having their own music scene, but of course it makes perfect sense. Tracy chattered happily as they all made their way back to the dance floor, rejoining the party. which had only gotten more excitable since they'd left. Many people had shed the bulky, formal outer layer of their robes, and those that couldn't had settled for rolling up sleeves and loosening a few top buttons. Professor McGonagall was dancing with Ludo Bagman again, both of them slightly ruddy in the cheeks as they swayed and bobbed to the music. There was no sign of Hagrid and Madame Maxime. Professor Dumbledore was in the middle of a surprisingly lively quick-step with Madame Hooch, who had her head thrown back with laughter. Professor Lupin, mercifully, was nowhere in sight. Violet composed her face into a grin as George's arms settled around her waist once more and pulled her close. The teachers looked to have given up on keeping people an appropriate distance apart, as evidenced by Fred and Angelina only a few steps away, moving in a confusing tangle of hair and limbs. But as warm and solid as George was, and as enthusiastically as they were dancing, Violet still felt that same strange chill. It lingered on her bare arms and shoulders, trickling like rainwater down the back of her neck. She kept feeling the need to look over her shoulder, expecting to find either black or hazel eyes fixed on her from within the crowd, but she never glimpsed her godfather or her head of house anywhere in the great hall. Her smile didn't waver, shoe-shaving a great amount of fun again, but nor did she manage to get completely warm. As they tore up the dance floor for the rest of the night, Violet kept catching sight of her brother on the sidelines, sitting with Ron and apparently deep in conversation. Neither of their dates were anywhere in sight. Hermione and Victor Crumb, however, never left each other's company. When the Weird Sisters finished playing at midnight, everyone gave them a last, loud round of applause and started to wind their way into the entrance hall. Many people were expressing the wish that the ball could have gone on longer, but Violet was perfectly happy to be going to bed. As fun as the whole thing was, her feet were killing her, and her dress was starting to feel uncomfortably heavy. Out in the entrance hall, she and George came to a halt at the base of the grand marble staircase. Their respective common rooms were in opposite directions down for her, up for him, and neither felt like making the long journey back and forth. "So," said George, still red in the face from their exuberant dancing, "I suppose this is good night then." "Suppose it is," Violet repeated. I had a really wonderful time with you. Thanks for, asking me." "You're thanking me," said George, laughing. "Blimey, it must be good." The two of them were still standing quite close together, even as the milling crowd began to thin around them. George looked at her, his smile softening slightly. His brown eyes dropped briefly to her lips, and Violet felt butterflies erupt in her stomach once more. As George leaned in, she let her eyes fall shut. This kiss was far easier than the one in the garden. There were no fireworks this time, only a slow and subtle warmth that glowed to life within her, finally chasing away the last of the awful chill. Violet felt as light as air. She might have floated all the way up to the high, vaulted ceiling, if not anchored by the feel of George's lips against hers, and his hand resting lightly on her hip. It was a bright, wonderful feeling that Violet hoped would go on forever. Someone nearby laughed loudly, and the two of them broke apart, looking around self-consciously. But the laughter wasn't directed at them. Plenty of other couples were saying good night around them, parting ways back to their separate houses. Violet looked shyly at George, and found him looking shyly back at her. His lips were stained red again, though not as badly as before she decided not to tell him about it this time. After a final good night, Violet quickly made her way down the steps to the Slytherin dungeons, her cheeks flaming. Tracy and Cassius were already in the common room. Cass was sprawled in one of the black leather armchairs, fiddling with his cuffs while Tracy chatted excitedly at him. They both looked up when Violet stepped into the room. "I was wondering when you get in," Tracy said, hurrying up to meet her. She took Violet's hands in both of her own, a very sly grin on her plump face. "So, tell me everything. Did he kiss you, or did you kiss him?" Violet hadn't thought it was possible for her cheeks to get any hotter, but apparently she was wrong. Can we not talk about this here?" she muttered, painfully aware of just how many people were still lingering around the common room. Malfoy and Pansy were taking up their usual place by the fire. Pansy had her head resting on his shoulder, but Draco's arm was resting around the back of the sofa, not on her. Crabbe and Goyle, dateless, were slumped awkwardly in the chairs around them. "Let's go get undressed then," Tracy said, making Violet choke. "I had a wonderful time, but I don't know how people can stay dressed up like this for so many hours. Do your feet hurt too? Mine feel like they might fall off." She held fast to one of Violet's hands and set off toward their dormitory. Cass, still seated, didn't move. "G-night, Cass," Violet said as she passed him. His eyes were open, but he didn't look at her. Just before vanishing down the stairs, Violet thought she heard him say, "Night, Romans 6."